For centuries, the origin story of the Slavs appeared straightforward. A people emerging from the forests and marshlands of Eastern Europe in the early medieval period, expanding rapidly across the continent, carrying a common language and a shared cultural template that would eventually shape nearly half of Europe. But when ancient DNA was extracted from burials long assumed to be early Slavic, the genetic signatures did not align neatly with that narrative. Some individuals carried deep lineages rooted in the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Others revealed continuity with earlier European farming populations. Still others bore traces of northern hunter-gatherers. The genetic landscape was not singular, it was layered. If these findings hold, and they do under rigorous peer review, then the forbidden history of Slavic genetic origins is not a story of sudden emergence, nor of biological uniformity. It is a reconstruction of mixture, movement, and adaptive convergence across millennia. And it forces a recalibration of how identity itself is anchored to the past. The traditional narrative was shaped by texts. Byzantine chroniclers in the 6th century described groups called Sclavini and Antes appearing along the Danube frontier. Archaeologists later associated these names with specific pottery styles, settlement patterns, and cremation burials spreading across Eastern Europe. Language reconstruction traced Proto-Slavic to a homeland somewhere north of the Carpathians. The implication hardened over time, a relatively coherent population expanding outward in a defined historical window. That framework was not invented arbitrarily. It rested on linguistic reconstruction, material culture similarities, and the abrupt appearance of Slavic toponyms across wide territories in the early medieval period. For generations, this convergence of language and archaeology appeared sufficient. But the scientific record tells a more complex story. Genome-wide sequencing of skeletal remains from Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Western Russia, and the Balkans has begun to map ancestry at a scale unavailable to earlier historians. Carbon dating refines chronology with decade-level precision. Stable isotope analysis reconstructs diet and mobility. Admixture modeling measures the proportion of ancestry components inherited from earlier populations. When these independent evidence systems converge, they do not describe a single point of origin. They describe a population gradient shaped by deep time processes. Long before the earliest mention of Slavs in written sources, Eastern Europe was a corridor of repeated migrations. During the late Paleolithic, hunter-gatherers repopulated the region after glacial retreat. In the Neolithic, farming communities expanded from Anatolia into the Balkans and Central Europe, intermixing with local foragers. In the Bronze Age, pastoralist groups associated with the Yamnaya horizon moved westward from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, introducing new ancestry components and Indo-European languages. Ancient DNA shows that present-day Slavic-speaking populations carry varying proportions of all three of these deep-time layers: Western hunter-gatherer, early European farmer ancestry, and steppe pastoralist ancestry. None are exclusive, none are absent. What appears in early medieval cemeteries is not the birth of a new biological population. It is the reconfiguration of older genetic substrates under new linguistic and cultural conditions. In several burial sites attributed archaeologically to early Slavic communities, such as those in southeastern Poland and western Ukraine, genome sequencing reveals substantial continuity with late Iron Age and Roman-era populations already living in those regions. There is no sharp genetic discontinuity around the 6th century, no evidence of wholesale replacement. Instead, there is demographic expansion. Effective population size estimates derived from runs of homozygosity suggest growth after the late antiquity period. This expansion likely amplified certain regional ancestry profiles, making them more visible in the genetic record. But amplification is not origin. Meanwhile, Y chromosome lineages often associated with Slavic populations today, such as subclades of haplogroup R1a, trace their deeper ancestry to Bronze Age steppe groups. Yet these lineages are not uniquely Slavic. They appear across Eurasia. Their frequency in Slavic-speaking regions reflects founder effects and drift during medieval expansions, not isolated creation events. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited maternally, tells a parallel story of mixture. Lineages common in Central and Eastern Europe predate Slavic linguistic expansion by thousands of years. The maternal genetic substrate is older than the cultural label. This is where assumption begins to fracture. If genetics does not mark a clear boundary for the emergence of the Slavs, then what does? Archaeology suggests patterns of settlement organization, semi-subterranean dwellings, specific ceramic styles, cremation practices. But these material signatures can diffuse through cultural transmission without large-scale biological movement. Language can spread through elite dominance, trade networks, or demographic advantage without requiring genetic homogeneity. The absence of genetic rupture around the time Slavic languages proliferate across Eastern Europe forces a shift in perspective. The category Slavic may represent a linguistic and cultural expansion superimposed upon a genetically diverse but regionally continuous population. This interpretation gains strength when examining the Balkans. Early medieval Slavic incursions into southeastern Europe were described as massive invasions in historical texts. Yet ancient DNA from burials dated before and after these incursions reveals continuity mixed with incremental northern ancestry inputs. There is admixture, yes, but not erasure. Local populations contributed substantially to the emerging genetic landscape of South Slavic groups. Admixture modeling consistently shows that modern Slavic-speaking populations form a cline rather than a cluster. East Slavs, West Slavs, and South Slavs each reflect different proportions of pre-existing regional ancestries, combined with shared components inherited from earlier Indo-European expansions. Statistical distinctiveness appears as gradients, not as isolated peaks. Distinctiveness here is statistical. It is not hierarchical. It reflects patterns of gene flow, drift, and demographic growth interacting with geography. The forbidden aspect of Slavic genetic origins is not hidden evidence, it is the discomfort of complexity. The expectation of a singular homeland, a unified ancestral core, dissolves under genomic scrutiny. What emerges instead is a case study in how populations crystallize culturally while remaining biologically entangled. Climate shifts during late antiquity likely played a role. The late antique Little Ice Age altered agricultural productivity and settlement viability across parts of Europe. Population contractions in some regions created ecological openings in others. Groups speaking early Slavic dialects might have expanded demographically into these spaces, not as a genetically novel people, but as a linguistically cohesive network. Here, demography amplifies language. Language organizes identity. Genetics records continuity beneath both. Archaeological horizons, once labeled as markers of Slavic ethnogenesis, now appear as adaptive responses within broader regional systems. Pottery styles align with local resource availability. Settlement dispersion correlates with subsistence strategies suited to forest-steppe ecologies. Burial practices shift alongside religious transformation and social organization. None of these required genetic isolation. Ancient DNA studies also revealed that Slavic-speaking regions maintained gene flow with neighboring non-Slavic populations throughout the medieval period. Baltic, Germanic, Finno-Ugric, and Balkan groups all contributed ancestry at measurable levels. Genetic boundaries rarely align with linguistic ones. And yet, certain ancestry components did rise in frequency during early medieval expansions. What the data revealed next recalibrated the timeline. Genome-wide analyses comparing Iron Age individuals from Eastern Europe to early medieval burials indicate that the ancestry profile associated with Slavic-speaking populations was already forming centuries before written records described their appearance. The demographic substrate predates the name. In other words, the people later called Slavs were not born in the 6th century. They were the descendants of populations already present, reorganized under new linguistic and social frameworks. This reframes the question entirely. The origin of Slavs is not a moment, it is a process. Processes leave signatures different from events. They appear as gradual frequency shifts, increasing genetic similarity across dispersed settlements and expanding networks of relatedness detectable through shared haplotypes. These patterns are visible in ancient genomes sampled across Central and Eastern Europe. Importantly, genetics cannot reconstruct language directly. It cannot label a skeleton as Slavic. It can only measure biological ancestry. The correlation between genetic clusters and linguistic groups is probabilistic, not absolute. Scholars debate the precise homeland of Proto-Slavic. Competing models place it in the Pripet marshes, the middle Dnieper basin, or regions north of the Carpathians. Genetic data supports continuity in all these zones, but it does not isolate one as uniquely foundational. Instead, it indicates a broad interaction sphere in which related dialects and cultural forms emerged. The scientific process itself remains iterative. New samples adjust models. Additional carbon dates refine sequences. Statistical tools evolve, revealing subtler admixture events. Each dataset narrows uncertainty without eliminating it. But one conclusion holds under current evidence. Slavic genetic origins cannot be reduced to a single migration wave or ancestral isolate. They represent the convergence of deep European lineages, Bronze Age steppe contributions, and early medieval demographic expansion within a connected continental system. The implication extends beyond Slavic history. It illustrates a broader evolutionary mechanism. Human populations rarely originate ex nihilo. They coalesce from pre-existing diversity. Cultural identities crystallize faster than genomes change. Names attach to networks already in motion. When mythology fills gaps in evidence, it often favors singular origins. Singular origins are narratively efficient. They simplify lineage. They create clarity. Genetics complicates clarity. It replaces singularity with gradients. In the case of Slavic genetic origins, the forbidden history is not one of suppression, but of oversimplification. The biological record refuses to conform to neat ethnogenetic boundaries. It shows exchange across rivers, forests, and frontiers long before political borders hardened. The Slavic expansion becomes a demographic lens rather than a biological genesis. It demonstrates how language families can spread across genetically continuous landscapes,
reorganizing identity without rewriting ancestry from scratch. This pattern repeats across human history, from the spread of Indo-European languages to the diffusion of agriculture, from Bantu expansions in Africa to Austronesian dispersals across the Pacific. Cultural coherence emerges atop genetic mosaics. Underneath, the code remains mixed. The case study of Slavic genetic origins ultimately destabilizes any claim that modern identity maps cleanly onto ancient biological divisions. It reveals instead how adaptation, exchange, and demographic opportunity sculpt populations over time. Forests, once thought to conceal an origin, conceal something else entirely. A record of movement layered upon movement, ancestry braided rather than singular. And if the Slavs, one of Europe's largest linguistic groups, emerged not from isolation but from convergence, then the question broadens. How many other origin stories dissolve when sequenced? How many identities rest on demographic processes still unfolding in the genome? Beyond the marshes and river basins of Eastern Europe lies a deeper pattern, one that connects steppe migrations, climate oscillations, and the recombination of DNA across generations into a single evolutionary continuum. The map of humanity wasn't written in a lab, it was carved by the sea and the stone. This is Helix Horizon, where we trace the code that refuses to stay still. And if Slavic origins are a case study in convergence rather than creation, then the next investigation must turn further back, toward the Bronze Age corridors where language, mobility, and ancestry first began to entangle at continental scale. As the early medieval period unfolded, the genetic patterns in Eastern Europe continued to evolve, not through dramatic invasions, but through subtle, cumulative processes of mobility, admixture, and localized growth. Analysis of DNA from the forest-steppe interface in modern Belarus and Western Russia revealed that populations previously considered peripheral were in fact active nodes of exchange. Individuals buried with early Slavic-associated artifacts carried admixture signals linking the Pontic steppe, the Baltic forests, and Central European farming communities. This was not a patchwork of isolated groups. It was a network of interrelated populations whose genetic contours shifted across centuries, reflecting both movement and integration.
The archaeological record reinforces this dynamic. Settlement layouts, previously interpreted as markers of ethno-linguistic identity, correlate more closely with resource availability, subsistence strategies, and defensive considerations than with a fixed Slavic blueprint. Pottery styles, once labeled as definitive of early Slavic culture, are now understood as adaptive expressions emerging at the interface of multiple influences: Iron Age traditions, steppe contacts, and local innovation. Genetic continuity underlines that these cultural shifts were not accompanied by wholesale population replacement. They were overlays on long-standing biological substrates. Mitochondrial lineages across early medieval cemeteries show remarkable resilience. Many of the maternal haplotypes trace back to Neolithic farmers of Central and Eastern Europe, persisting through successive waves of migration. Paternal lineages, while more variable due to demographic expansions, demonstrate founder effects amplified by social structures rather than isolation. These patterns reveal a critical insight. Ancestry was never uniform, yet social and linguistic cohesion emerged. Identity crystallized atop a heterogeneous genetic foundation. Stable isotope analyses add another layer. Diet and mobility studies indicate that individuals within ostensibly homogeneous settlements had widely varying access to resources,
reflecting both local adaptation and long-distance connections. The movement of peoples, animals, and goods across rivers and plains created microcosms of genetic and cultural mixing that predate the historically attested Slavic expansion. Genetic drift, recombination, and admixture were active forces, continuously reshaping the population structure over centuries. When these strands are integrated, the picture becomes clear. The early Slavs were not a product of a singular demographic event. They were an emergent identity arising from pre-existing populations, reorganized under new linguistic and social frameworks. The Slavic gene is not a monolith. It is a statistical gradient tracing back through millennia of interaction. This realization destabilizes any simplistic model of ethnogenesis tied to a single homeland or migration myth. Moreover, ancient DNA demonstrates that the Slavic expansion involved continual interaction with non-Slavic neighbors. Genomes from the Balkans, the Baltic, and the Carpathian Basin reveal admixture with Germanic, Finno-Ugric, and pre-existing Balkan populations. These exchanges were not episodic. They were sustained processes that gradually altered ancestry proportions. What emerges is a portrait of human populations as fluid networks, continuously integrating local and incoming lineages rather than following a predetermined map of origin. Language appears to have spread more rapidly than genes. Proto-Slavic likely diffused along trade routes, river corridors, and settlements already occupied by genetically diverse populations. Archaeology supports this. Ceramic types, burial rites, and settlement patterns show cultural adoption across regions without requiring biological replacement. Linguistic and social identities can propagate independently of genomic homogeneity, creating an illusion of a unified ancestral origin where none existed. This forces a fundamental recalibration of the historical framework. Slavic identity, long thought to arise from a distinct demographic core, instead emerges as a cultural phenomenon built upon centuries of genetic continuity and regional admixture. The populations labeled as Slavic in historical sources were the inheritors of deep European lineages, restructured socially and linguistically into a coherent network. It is here that the forbidden history becomes most instructive. Genetic data does not validate narratives of sudden ethnogenesis or singular origin myths. Instead, it highlights continuity, mixture, and gradual transformation, processes often invisible in the textual and material record. These findings align with broader evolutionary patterns. Humans consistently reorganize, adapt, and integrate, producing cultural cohesion without necessitating biological uniformity. Thus, the Slavs exemplify a recurring mechanism in human history: identity formation as a dynamic overlay atop a mosaic of ancestral lineages. It is a reminder that the categories we inherit, linguistic, cultural, or national, rarely map cleanly onto biological history. The forbidden history of Slavic genetics teaches that ancestry is neither static nor singular. It is a palimpsest of migrations, adaptations, and exchanges etched into DNA across millennia. By focusing on measurable evidence rather than narrative convenience, the picture of Slavic origins becomes both richer and more destabilizing. The neat map of discrete peoples dissolves, replaced by gradients, flows, and interactions that challenge entrenched assumptions about European history. Populations once assumed to be peripheral emerge as active participants in the formation of identity networks. Lineages once thought to define a homeland are revealed as ancient continuities integrated across centuries of movement. In the end, the forbidden history of Slavic genetic origins reframes the very concept of ancestry. It is not a story of origin points or pure bloodlines. It is a story of convergence, of demographic layering, and of the continual recombination that characterizes human populations everywhere. Every genome carries echoes of migration, adaptation, and interaction. The Slavic case is simply a particularly well-documented example. And in that recognition lies a profound implication. If the identity we call Slavic is a product of integration and reorganization rather than abrupt creation, then the human story itself may need to be read less as a series of discrete beginnings and more as an ongoing process of convergence, recombination, and adaptation. The rivers and forests of Eastern Europe did not produce the Slavs in isolation. They orchestrated a complex interplay of movement, survival, and cultural alignment that continues to resonate in the genomes of their descendants. The question now extends beyond linguistic labels and archaeological horizons. If convergence shaped the Slavs, how many other populations carry similar hidden palimpsests? How many assumed origins dissolve under the lens of genetic scrutiny? And how might these hidden patterns inform our understanding of human adaptation, resilience, and the entangled processes that define our shared past? The deeper one probes the ancient genomes of Eastern Europe, the more apparent it becomes that geographic and environmental pressures guided genetic reshaping long before the early medieval period. Post-glacial recolonization of northern forests and river valleys created microhabitats in which hunter-gatherer lineages persisted alongside incoming agricultural communities. Over generations, these lineages did not vanish, they recombined, producing a patchwork genetic landscape that would later underlie populations identified as Slavic. Radiocarbon-dated burials in the upper Dnieper basin reveal continuity spanning millennia. Teeth and petrous bones analyzed for isotopes show localized diets, yet genetic signatures indicate occasional long-distance mobility, hinting at connections to the Pontic steppe, the Carpathian highlands, and even northern Baltic regions. These patterns underscore a recurring evolutionary principle. Human populations rarely remain isolated. Even in dense forested regions, trade, intermarriage, and seasonal migration ensured persistent gene flow. The archaeological markers once thought to define early Slavs, settlement density, pit houses, specific ceramics, align less with distinct population influxes and more with adaptive strategies to shifting ecologies. For instance, the transition from simple to complex pottery forms in the Pripet marshes correlates with seasonal flooding cycles, not necessarily with cultural inheritance from a single Slavic origin. Genetics confirms this. Mitochondrial lineages predate these innovations, demonstrating that material culture can spread independently of demographic upheaval. Genome-wide analysis also clarifies the relationship between paternal and maternal lineages. While Y chromosome diversity shows step-linked expansion during the early medieval period, maternal lineages reflect deeper Neolithic and Mesolithic continuity. This asymmetry is typical of migratory populations, where male-biased movements through warfare, trade, or settlement interact with stable local female ancestry. The result is a demographic mosaic, identities emerging from integration, not isolation.
Stable isotope studies complement this picture. Variations in strontium and oxygen ratios among burials indicate that some individuals moved dozens of kilometers during their lifetimes, while others remained highly localized. These mobility patterns created overlapping social networks, knitting together lineages from diverse ecological zones. Language, in this context, may have propagated along these networks more rapidly than genes, producing cultural cohesion without necessitating wholesale population replacement. In regions such as the Middle Vistula and Western Belarus, genetic continuity through the Iron Age into the early medieval period demonstrates that populations later identified as Slavic had roots stretching back thousands of years. The emergence of Slavic culture did not coincide with a corresponding genetic breakpoint. Instead, it reflects the reorganization of long-standing populations under a new linguistic framework. The forbidden aspect is that identity and genetics are not synonymous. Cultural labels can crystallize within fluid biological contexts, producing the appearance of a discrete origin where none existed. Further complexity emerges when examining admixture events. Modeling indicates incremental input from neighboring groups, Baltic, Germanic, and Finno-Ugric populations throughout the first millennium CE. No single wave dominates. Instead, the genetic record is a gradual accumulation of interactions shaped by geography, trade, and ecological opportunity. These processes mirror broader patterns of European prehistory. Ray expansions rarely erase previous populations, but overlay, integrate, and reorganize them. Burial practices provide an additional layer of evidence. Early medieval cemeteries attributed to Slavic-speaking groups showed diversity in rites. Inhumation and cremation coexisted, orientations varied, and grave goods included items from distant regions. Genetics confirms that these variations were not the result of distinct biological groups, but of culturally mediated choices within genetically continuous populations. The interplay of ritual and ancestry illustrates the decoupling of material expression from biological lineage. The emergent picture is that of a demographic continuum punctuated by episodes of mobility and integration. Steppe-derived haplotypes increased in frequency through drift and local expansion rather than mass migration. Neolithic maternal lineages persisted, anchoring populations to earlier European agricultural communities. Hunter-gatherer ancestry remained detectable, particularly in northern zones. Across this gradient, cultural identity, expressed through language, settlement structure, and ritual, solidified faster than genome-wide ancestry changed. Thus, early Slavic genetic origins are not a story of creation, but of transformation. They exemplify how populations consolidate culturally while maintaining deep, mixed genetic roots. Evolutionary forces, gene flow, drift, founder effects, intersected with ecological pressures, social organization, and linguistic propagation to produce a recognizable Slavic identity atop a mosaic of ancestries. And yet, the full extent of these interactions is still being revealed. Ancient DNA sampling is uneven, archaeological interpretation remains debated, and the boundaries between linguistic, cultural, and genetic identity are probabilistic, not absolute. The forbidden history of Slavic genetics, therefore, is an ongoing investigation, a lens into the broader mechanisms that shape human populations: convergence, admixture, adaptation, and the emergence of identity atop a constantly shifting genetic foundation. This case invites a larger question. If identity crystallizes atop such deep and mixed genetic substrates, how many other populations, long assumed to have singular origins, conceal equally complex ancestries beneath their historical and linguistic labels? The forbidden history does not end here. It only opens a door into the intricate architecture of human evolution, migration, and cultural formation.
a door that leads further into the tangled corridors of our shared past, waiting to be traced through the double helix and the stone alike. If Slavic origins are a case study in convergence rather than creation, then the horizon stretches beyond the early medieval forests and river valleys. Steppe corridors, Neolithic farmlands, and glacial refugia all hold untapped genomes, waiting to reveal how the threads of ancestry, migration, and adaptation braided across Europe long before names were written down. Each new sample recalibrates what we thought we knew, showing that the labels we inherit, Slavic, Germanic, Baltic, capture culture more than genome. And in that recognition lies the unresolved question: how many other populations celebrated for a singular origin are instead the product of millennia of integration, expansion, and subtle demographic realignment? How many identities, firmly inscribed in history, are really mosaics waiting to be decoded? The forbidden history of Slavic genetics ends not with closure, but with an opening, a doorway into the tangled continuum of human ancestry, where every river, ridge, and steppe may carry the echoes of convergence yet to be fully understood. The next investigation must look farther back, to the Bronze Age corridors of Europe, where mobility, climate, and culture first intertwined to produce the lineages that centuries later would become Slavs. And from there, the map of humanity continues to unfold.